As promised, Dr. E. Michael Jones, editor of Culture Wars magazine, author of Degenerate Moderns and Slaughter of Cities and Barren Metal and Libido Dominandi and Monsters from the Id, and this enjoyable tome, Logos Rising, A History of Ultimate Reality. Michael Jones, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Normally your books are 1,100 pages. This comes in at like a mere 840 pages, something like that.
Yes, I was thinking of calling it a short history of ultimate reality.
I think that wry irony would not have been lost. When people say, "Well, gee, it's a large book and it's more expensive than the average book," my reply is, you're actually getting several books in this compilation. This, I call it a magisterial romp through the history of beginnings. Did this book germinate over time? Did it sort of come to you whole cloth, or are these ideas that you developed over time talking about other things?
It grew out of the Jewish revolutionary spirit, because I couldn't write that book without the term logos. Mm-hmm. Because the central thesis of that book is that Jesus Christ is the logos. That's obviously in the Gospel of St. John, but I had to unpack it there and say, that when the Jews killed Christ, they rejected logos. And when they rejected logos, they rejected the order of the universe. And when they rejected the order of the universe, they became revolutionaries. So I had to do that in that book. There's no other word I could have used. And then once I did that, then people started saying, well, what do you mean by logos? And then I started to think, I guess I have to explain that word. And so that eventually ended up with this book, because logos is the source of who we are. It is the ultimate reality of the universe. It is the turning point in human history. And so I needed to explain it and devote my attention to that topic exclusively.
What year did The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit come out?
2009.
Okay, and that was the book that got you expunged from polite society because you were taken
Yes,
to...
I was.
Go ahead.
I was no longer fit for polite company after I wrote that book. I mean, I was on my way out already, but I mean, that was the final nail in my coffin of respectability. So yes, you're right. It
sounds like you, in your career, you've been the pariah. You were fired from St. Mary's College in South Bend for your position on abortion. Namely, you were against it. So you were already on the outs as far as operating beyond the shadow of the ivory tower. Have you always been drawn to ideas that are unpopular and kind of going against the grain of conventional thinking?
It's something. It must be some type of unconscious thing with me. I don't understand it. I'm not trying to be kicked out, but I always get kicked out. I invariably get kicked out of every organization that I try to join. And I'm sure it's a character flaw on my part, but I mean, I'm too late. I guess it's too late to do anything about it. I mean, after I got kicked.
Good.
Yeah, I would never join a club that would accept me as a member. So maybe every time they accept me as a member, I feel upset and want to get kicked out of it. I don't know. I'll have to go to a psychiatrist to figure that one out, I guess. But
probably not.
I mean, after I was kicked out of the St. Mary's, I tried to establish this magazine, and then I did the book on Medjugorje, and then I got kicked out of that club. And then I got kicked out of the conservative club, and so here I am.
What adjectives would you use to describe yourself and the mission of Culture Wars? Do you have any?
Adjectives. Sincere. Just a desire to get impatience with confected narratives that are supposed to keep you imprisoned in your ignorance. I think that's the constant. I've been, and sometimes I don't even know. I don't even know that I'm goring someone's ox. Sometimes I kind of blunder into it. But I mean, that's the story of my life.
When I first encountered your books, it was at Franciscan University of Steubenville. I did a graduate program there in theology, and we had to read Degenerate Moderns. And one of the scales that fell from my eyes was your chapter on Luther's legacy, and it really got me thinking about this this conflict throughout time that we call history. That one set of ideas will be crushed by either a boot or a gun or some other set of ideas, and then from that there'll be a kind of resurrection of an old order. And then I read Libido Dominandi, and it was in Libido Dominandi, Dr. Jones, that I noticed that you were kind of stumbling upon a certain pattern, and that is the preponderance of a very narrow set of interests that were selling these revolutionary ideas. And you didn't say, "Oh, this is called the Jewish revolutionary spirit." Why does that book arouse so much anger in people? Why do they immediately jump to, "You must be an anti-Semite"? Because I've seen you interview Jews who don't disagree with you.
Yes, it's because you're not allowed to criticize a Jew. It's that simple. And I didn't know I was doing it. So if you go to Dionysus Rising, that whole chapter on Arnold Schoenberg was a critique of basically the Jewish attitude toward music, and I didn't know it. I had a rabbi, Rabbi Dresner, Sam Dresner, used to tell me, tell other Catholics they should subscribe to my magazine because it was a great magazine. And I had reviewed his book and so on and so forth. And at one point he said to me, "Why do you always talk about Jews?" I said, "What do you mean talk about Jews? When do I talk about Jews? I didn't know I was talking about Jews." And at that point, I started to become conscious that maybe that Schoenberg thing and these other people fit together in a different way. And that, along with the neocon takeover of our foreign policy in 2003, got me thinking. Maybe there is something to this story, and that's what led to the book. But you can, in many ways, every book I write, grows out of the book I just wrote. Mm-hmm. So writing John Cardinal Kroll opened me to the idea that something happened to the cities, and I wrote Slaughter of Cities, Urban Renewal as Ethnic Cleansing. That's just the way it works. Mm-hmm. It's like I can't get to the top until I do this bottom part here. So you're like building a pyramid, one layer at a time. And you can't get to the next layer until you complete this layer. And each book is a prelude to another book. That's the way it's worked.
Was it Joe Sobran who said that anti-Semitism used to be someone who didn't like Jews, and now it's become someone Jews don't like? Is that Joe Sobran?
Yes, that was Joe Sobran. I mean, that's where I got it.
I got so much anger unleashed at me, Dr. Jones, when I first interviewed you. And the fact that I've had you back, this is, I think, our fourth conversation, was not me trying to, stick my finger in someone's eye, saying, I'll show you. I just don't understand why people can't simply disagree. The vitriol level is way out of proportion to the discussion underhand. I mean, I know conservative Jews. I've interviewed a long string of them. I won't name them because it sounds like, some of my best friends are black. But right. Why I just don't understand the and it crosses denominational and political lines. People on the far right and people on the far left. There's just a weird reaction to things when you talk about logos, the rejection of logos. What is a revolution? What was the proportion of Bolsheviks or the Vienna school, the Frankfurt school rather? It just keeps cropping up over and over again. And people who notice it
does.
And the heavy hand of the Holocaust and so on I think it intimidates people. And they don't, maybe the goal is to shut down conversation so that there's no interchange.
That is the goal. That is the goal. There are certain things you're not allowed to talk about. And suddenly when you get to that, you realize, wait a minute, holy smoke, there's a whole barrier that I didn't even know because I was steering clear of it. And now suddenly when you get there, you realize, no, you're not allowed to talk about this. So just to give you one instance of this, I was invited to Armenia, okay? And it got canceled because everything got canceled. But then I thought, I'll do a little research, and I think, I'll look into the Armenian genocide. What do I know? Nothing. My father used to say when I wouldn't eat my food, he'd say, think of the starving Armenians. That's how I knew about this type of thing. So I look into it, and the state of the art there is basically Armenians pointing their fingers at the Turks and Turks pointing their fingers at the Armenians and say, you guys are responsible. Okay, so I look into it. Well, guess what happened here? Guess what I discovered? I discovered the Jewish revolutionary spirit. Not even looking for it, I discovered it. Because what happened here is that you had, at this point in time, let's say the late 19th century, you have large numbers of people converting to the Jewish revolutionary spirit. So both Armenians and Turks were abandoning their traditional beliefs and joining revolutionary movements like Narodnaya Volia in Russia, which was a Jewish revolutionary movement. There was a traditional Russian revolutionary movement, and the Jews got nowhere because it was back to the land and the peasants wouldn't listen to them. So they formed their own movement, which was based on terrorism. Richard Pipes, who was a Jew, professor at Harvard, said it's the first terrorist organization in the world. This suddenly threw the whole Armenian genocide question into a totally new construct, a totally new context, only because there is this concept out there called the Jewish revolutionary spirit. So it wasn't just me. It wasn't just a category in my mind. It's out there. And it helps you to understand, and it helped me understand the Armenian genocide. It was like putting a key into a lock and the door opened. So I felt vindicated. It's not just me. It's out there. And it's in there, all of human history, and that's what the book is about.
We're going to revisit this when we get to the incarnation in part 2 of this conversation. I want to, if we can, press rewind and go way back. For people listening to my show, they know that I'm very interested in philosophy and argumentation, how to spot fallacies. And early on in Logos Rising, you summarize the basic problems with the four horsemen of the apocalypse: Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, the late Chris Hitchens, rest his soul, and Richard Dawkins. Can you go summarize, if you could, the example that the late Chris Hitchens uses of the eyeball? Because it goes to this, both Dawkins and Hitchens had this idea that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have this gradual evolution and natural selection that avoids the obvious. How did something go from non-being to being?
Right.
But that image of the eyeball and the way you take it apart was very fascinating.
Well, I mean, it's an all or nothing proposition. And what you realize throughout history is all of these things are all or nothing propositions. Now, it could be the jaw, the wing. There is a design here. They are designed to do something like that. So what you're saying is, well, how did we get up to that point? Well, there must have been a gradual evolution. Well, you can't have a gradual evolution because no matter how you try to describe it, you're always going from non-being to being. And you cannot do that. And the man who discovered you cannot do that is Parmenides. This is one of the early steps of the development of Logos. Okay, that which is cannot come from that which is not. That's what Parmenides said. It led to problems, obviously, because now you can't explain change, but it is a fundamental issue, a fundamental concept of ontology that is valid today. And the place where it's best applicable is evolution. Because evolution is constantly telling you can go from that which is not to that which is. Now, they try and fudge it, okay? And Hitchens tries to do it with the eyeball, and Dawkins tries to do it with the wing, okay? And so Dawkins will say, well, it looks impossible, but from Mount Improbable, there are two sides, and one's a big leap and the other's a gradual slope. And if you go up the gradual slope with small steps, it's easy. Well, what he forgot to say was every single step along that gradual slope is a step from non-being to being. And you can't get there. You cannot do that. Nothing can come from nothing. Okay, so what you're seeing here is biology as bad metaphysics. Dawkins has no idea about metaphysics, complete ignoramus when it comes to this. And he tries to substitute biology and these gradual steps without understanding that you can't do it. You can't get there from here. So he says, well, suppose you had 49% of a wing and you fell out of a tree. Well, 49% of a wing is better than no wing at all, right? Well, wait a minute, professor. If it's 49% of a wing, it's a wing. So you've already got the wing that you're trying to prove came out of evolution. So it's a circular argument. You've already got a wing. You've already made that claim. The same thing was true with Hitchens' eyeballs. It began with light-sensitive cells. Well, wait a minute. Those light-sensitive cells that you're talking about, either they can see, in which case you've already got an eye, or they cannot see, in which case you don't have an eye. But it's one or the other. So it's a tautology. You're already talking about something you already have.
Could you say the whole idea of survival of the fittest is a tautology? Because none of the parts of the argument add anything. Survival of the fittest. How do you know? Because the fittest survived. How did they survive? Because they were the strongest. Well, wait a second. That doesn't get you out of the gate.
No, you're exactly right. It's a tautology. It's a circular argument. And the best way out of it is to explain metaphysics and logos and these early steps that these people took in Ionia to enable human progress. We had to do this. We had to come to some understanding of ultimate reality that was independent of this mythologizing that had come into the world, codified by Homer. Mm-hmm. And all those gods fighting. Gods don't fight with each other. First of all, there can only be one. And secondly, he's not going to fight. Now, we do have an understanding that God is a father. And that's not just a revelation. That is a universal understanding. It came out in Jupiter is basically Zeus Pater. It's the Romans, the Greeks, everybody had it. So that's true. It is true. We would call that logoi spermatikoi, the seeds of logos that God put into the universe, into the mind of man. Mm-hmm. But it went down the wrong road because you start saying, well, God is a father. He must have a beard. And if he's got a beard, well, then does he shave every day or does he shave every other day? And you go down that road and you're going nowhere because you're going away from God into the metaphor. And that's not what God is. Okay?
Yeah. I think Christian art, in its well-meaning attempt to visualize the Trinity, say in stained glass, created a problem. Because if God is an old man with a long white beard, then Jesus must be a younger man with a short brown beard. And then the Holy Spirit's what? A dove, a bird, a flame? There's nowhere to go.
Right. You're going beyond. First of all, the whole point of Logos is that it went into a level of abstraction that was necessary. Because before that, they were saying, well, the ultimate reality is water. The ultimate reality is fire. The ultimate reality is air. These are all material things, and we had to go beyond material things in order to understand this. If you're talking about the ultimate immaterial thing, you're talking about God. And so anytime you have an analogy, it's going to be fall short. It's going to fall short of the reality.
And who was the first to use or popularize Logos? Heraclitus?
I think it was Heraclitus, yes, who also said it was fire. And in many ways, fire, and this is all in Ionia, which is basically on the coast of Turkey right now, in Western Turkey. These were Greek colonies, and they were ruled by Persia at the time. And there are people who say that Heraclitus was influenced by Zoroastrianism, which worships fire. And there is, fire does create an interesting image because it is the note energy. It's what we would call energy, and energy is certainly an integral part of the universe. And energy is constantly changing and constantly the same, like the water flowing in a river. So it's profound. But he also came up with the word logos, and maybe so. I postulate in the book, well, maybe fire is logos in action, and then you've got the whole spectrum of the book.
Yeah,
because you've got the first part is the history of Logos, where we have to understand what that term means. And then the second part is when we understand that, then we can see that there's a Logos to history, which includes time. And that was new. Yeah. Greeks had no sense of what time was.
And you say that, along with historian Christopher Dawson, that the discovery of time began in earnest with Augustine. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Yes.
So Thales argued that the fundamental ultimate reality was water. Heraclitus said it was fire. Axiomenes, who said it was air? Do you remember?
Air, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So they all have this they're all capturing a facet of the truth. They just don't have the fullness of it that perhaps didn't come until Logos was picked up by the author of the fourth gospel, St. John, in his John 1, verse 1. But talk a little bit, for people who have no exposure to the word, if you look up in a Greek interlinear or a lexicon, what do you find with the word logos?
You find column after column after column of English equivalents. And this is what struck me when I was studying Greek way back when. There's simply, and because of that, there is no other word that you can use. So it's not an affectation on my part to use the word logos, because there's no other word. And this becomes apparent with the translations of the Gospel of St. John. So, en arche en ha logos. In principio erat verbum. Well, now we're back to word. In the beginning, there was the word. Am Anfang war das Wort. So once you get away from the original Greek, they're all the same. And they all use the word word. And I don't know what it means. I'm sorry, but I didn't know what it meant. I just don't. I look at it. It was total. That's a totally mysterious sentence when you say in the beginning there was the word. But then when I suddenly realized, when I saw the word logos and all the English equivalents, I said, oh, now I understand what you're talking about. Because you're saying in the beginning there was this order to the universe that is related to our rationality. And language is one of the key principles of the universe, and we are the only ones who have it. So once you start bringing all that in, suddenly it makes a lot more sense. And then to jump from there to say, and Logos was with God, and Logos is God. Now I'm starting to understand the immensity of this type of statement, where you're taking, I mean, we have our separated brethren who like to complain about how the Catholic Church accepts pagan concepts. Well, do you accept the Gospel of St. John as canonical? Well, you're talking about pagans here, right? Because he didn't write, he wrote in Greek. And the Greeks had this thing called philosophy, and he baptized that philosophy. And we wouldn't have that gospel if we weren't able to use Greek concepts and Greek words. And this is the history of the church.
Maybe the thing that redeems word or gives it some intelligibility is a line from the memoirs of Helen Keller. She's talking to Annie Sullivan about now this is a woman who's blind and deaf, but once she had that insight that you can see it comes through in the film The Miracle Worker, where the unintelligibility of the outside world suddenly all of the external reality rushes into her mind through the signals that Miss Sullivan taught her. She eventually concluded that the soul is like the meaning of a word, and the word itself is the body of the meaning. I thought that's really beautiful. This sort of
yes.
A word with a speaker is a kind of metaphor or analogy to the human person. We're souls that you can't see, but we're also bodies that you not only can see, but they're the medium through which the invisibility of your mind is communicated. So then we're left with the Logos as the Word and God the Father as the speaker of the Word. I know you've pondered all this, but that was my takeaway.
And we're left with the gospel, where there are two, where it proposes the Trinity. The Trinity is not, the word Trinity is not in the Bible. You'll never find it. But once this was proposed, then they had to figure out, well, what is the relationship between the Son and the Father? And so what are the characteristics of the Son? What are the characteristics of the second person of the Blessed Trinity? There are two basic characteristics. One is Logos, and the other is Son. Mm-hmm. Why is it both of those things? Well, Logos, as I said, could be the abstract order of the universe, and the Greeks understood that there was something like that. And you could say, well, geometry. Yeah, that's a good example of what we're talking about, okay? But that's not enough.
Right.
Because it's a person, too. It's a son. That's a person. And so what you have here is not just an abstract principle. You've got someone who actually embodies that principle and puts it into action throughout all of human history. Mm-hmm. That's the powerful statement of St. John's Gospel.
Let's linger for a minute on speech. You'd spend some time on how profound language is as an irreducible jump from the animals. You could say with Aristotle that we're rational animals, but the idea of speech is unique to humanity. You could say it's unique to the angels too. The day I was trying to look for the email, I finally found Tom Wolfe's email. The day I went to email him to be on my show, because his last book is called The Kingdom of Speech, which is his secular broadside against Darwinian evolution. That was the day he died, so that never happened. But he goes on and on in that book about how we take speech for granted, but it's a completely mysterious phenomenon. And you say in Logos Rising that speech is the main identifier of a being that is made in the image and likeness of God, the Logos himself.
Right. And I also say it could not come about through evolution. Cannot do that. Because what would have to happen here? Okay? You'd have to have this gradual evolution that culminated in one person saying, "Hello, how are you?" And the other person saying, "I'm fine, thank you." Now, what are the chances of that? How would that ever be? Because that is the beginning of the human race. That is the first evidence that you have this rational creature. It comes from speech. Well, speech has to be spoken to someone. What are you speaking? You're speaking a language. And not only are you speaking a language where you have all of these concepts and little, you smacking your lips and suddenly these things have meaning. There's someone else who has to understand exactly what you're saying and able to respond. Well, that cannot come about through random mutation. That's impossible. I mean, I don't know how you would calculate the odds, but you can't do it. So Ratzinger picked this up at one point, and he said, well, the first man spoke to God. I suppose that's possible, because a man, according to the Genesis story, man was created, and once he was created, he had this opportunity to talk to God and probably said thank you. And God said, no problem. And then he created, and there was another human being who had exactly the same language. Now think of that. Do you know how hard it is to learn another language? It's difficult, and you've got all of those concepts there. You have to have them all at the beginning. It's an all or nothing proposition, because if it isn't, it's not a language. Yeah, and so the other person has to say, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
So Coco,
and you'll be able to talk.
Joan Goodall's Coco the gorilla doesn't literally speak or understand.
No, and I go through that whole story of Washu, the talking monkey, where if you're too young to remember, there was a whole story during the 1970s where we had finally broken through the language barrier, and there was a chimpanzee who knew how to talk. Well, wait a minute. Chimpanzees can't make any language, so it turns out it's sign language, and it turns out that basically sign language can be pretty ambiguous. And so you got this monkey doing things. And I know, he just said bird. He just said sky. He said water. He said bird. He's saying duck. Well, wait a minute. No, honey, you're just projecting things into this random motions. Or else the monkey does learn to make a certain motion because you give him a little banana pill. But It turns out that nobody could replicate it. And so that all the enthusiasm died very quickly, and the whole thing went down the memory hole. And guess what? We're back at square one. We're the only people that can talk. So we've been going to movies, and we've been watching Mickey Mouse talk to Minnie Mouse, and listening to Donald Duck, but basically they don't talk. Ducks go quack. I think ducks can communicate with each other. Because when I'm riding my bicycle down the path and it's covered with ducks, they all go quack, 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 which means something like a guy on bicycle coming, get out of the way. Something like that. That's communication. But it's not speech.
Approaches. Right. We'll be run over soon. Right. There's a profusion of movies and books about animals that can think and speak. The Beethoven series, Lion King, Marley and Me, Hachi. The more I think about it, there's lots of them. Animals with consciousness and the ability to speak, even if they
Mr. Ed,
right?
Horse.
Yeah, of course.
But it's a fantasy, and it doesn't work. I mean, we'd like to be able to think that the dog could tell us that he loves us, but he can't. He can wag his tail, he can bark, but he can't say anything. Mm-hmm. And those ducks, they can say, okay, there's a guy on a bicycle coming, get out of the way, but they can't say, look, if you're smart, you won't be here tomorrow because the guy's probably going to come by tomorrow. So don't be. No, they can't do that.
And they can't say. They don't have. They can't say first person singular. I am a duck.
No, they have no consciousness of themselves.
So language is the kind of interpersonal analog to wings and eyeballs.
That's right. It's all or nothing. It's either that thing that's on the back of your back allows you to fly, or it doesn't allow you to fly. And there's no such thing as a half a wing. Either it allows you to fly or it doesn't. There's no middle ground here. That spot on your skin either sees or it does not see. There's no intermediary stage here. And Darwinianism is based on intermediary structures. In other words, like having half an eye allows you to get closer to the prey and eat it than something that doesn't have any eye. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's all or nothing. There are no intermediary structures, so therefore no mechanism for natural selection.
Is this why Fred Hoyle, the atheist, I guess he was a astrophysicist, Fred Hoyle, got in trouble by saying that natural selection was as probable as having a tornado sweep through a junkyard and produce a 747.
Yeah, they never forgave him for saying that. They hated him because he said that. But then you're getting into the argument for design, and there's certainly an argument there, and I believe the argument, but I wanted to take it from a different angle.
You might know this, but many Catholic university students who say they lost their faith invariably point to a couple of reasons why, and evolution is almost always at the top of the list. They learn,
that's absolutely true.
Yeah, they learn that they're compatible, and they have a kind of a strained reading of the catechism, and they'll read this commentator and that commentator. Maybe that's a book in your pipeline on evolution. Extremely important.
Yeah, I've already written the other book, though. It's called Degenerate Moderns, which is basically, this is a true story. I was talking about evolution. There was a graduate of Notre Dame there. He said, I went to the class. I said, is this what you're saying? Did it all came from, and the priest said, yes, that's what I'm saying. That's what evolution is, and that's the truth. He said, well, what the hell? I went out and I slept with my girlfriend that night because I've been holding off. I figured, what the hell? There's no reason not to. It's all random mutation anyway, and that's what I did. So there's a direct correlation between education and moral decline when education is there to make you believe in evolution.
I just did a video called Can You Stay Catholic in College, and I talk about the Land O'Lakes statement from 1967, July. I know you know the story, but this goes to the concept of Logos, because if, as they did, Father Teddy Hesburgh and another signatory by the name of Father Theodore McCarrick and another guy named John Cogley, no one's quite sure why he was even there. Cogley eventually was a dissenter of Humanae Vitae and became an Episcopalian. But once you disconnect the life and teachings of Jesus Christ from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's account of that life and teaching, well, then, of course, your motivation for not fornicating vanishes, because that also rests on church authority. So if your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was an ape who somehow magically got a soul that we call Adam, then there's more continuity between me and a rabbit than between me and Logos itself. Am I overplaying the card here?
Right. No. And I think the first area where it had a devastating effect was capitalism.
How so?
Because Darwin was people write books all the time, but it was the Huxley family. T.H. Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog, and he promoted it among the elites in England at the time. T.S. Huxley is he's the great grandfather of Aldous Huxley, the man who wrote Brave New World, right. That family, famous English family. He was plugged into the elites, and he basically understood that this was great for capitalism because it removed moral restraint from the way the capitalist dealt with his with his worker. And it was also a rationalization for their accumulation of wealth, because it was survival of the fittest. And they were obviously the fittest because they had the most money, because that's the ultimate criterion of whether you're a good person or not, and fit for this to promote your genes, propagate your genes, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it fit like a hand in a glove with capitalism.
And so the market itself is, as the Lusitarians say, totally amoral. It's just like evolution.
So you obfuscate this whole thing by talking about a market without talking about, well, what is the market? Mm-hmm. And the market is basically you and me. You've got something to sell. I've got some money I want to buy, and we're trying to come to an agreement where we both make out. Now, in that exchange, there's going to be one person who is strong and the other person is weaker or stronger and weaker. And it will be always the tendency of the stronger to take advantage of the weaker, which means it's a moral issue. These are all potentially moral issues because you can force your will on the weak and take advantage of them. And the instance where this normally takes place is when you try to sell your labor to someone, because the employer always has the upper hand in this transaction.
And is that why
you need to work?
Is that what you just said, the basis for the strong papal endorsement of unions and the rights of the worker? I'm saying that the union allows the worker to stand on an equal footing with the employee or employer, almost an equal footing. The employer will always have the upper hand, but this makes the demands of labor stronger, and he has to pay attention. The great breakthrough in this regard came in the 1930s at the Dodge plant in Detroit, when the workers who were going on strike decided, we're not leaving the building, we're going to stay here. And that disrupted the whole manufacturing process. They couldn't hire scabs now, and so they had to settle. And that led to the great era of prosperity after World War II, when Henry Ford II sat down with the UAW and agreed to a decent wage. Mm-hmm. That's what led to prosperity. I want to ask you about usury, because usury is still condemned by the church. It was condemned by Aristotle and other pagan thinkers as being unnatural. So it's not something dogmatically applied because of revelation. It goes to what is natural. And Dante, was it in the Divine Comedy, puts usurers and sodomites in the same level of hell?
Yes. Yes.
Dante was a dot connector extraordinaire. Why is usury identified with sodomy?
Because the usurer takes what is sterile, namely money, and makes it fertile through compound interest. And the sodomite takes what is fertile, namely sex, and renders it sterile through his sexual activity. So they're the mirror image of each other. And so you have the usurer in the ninth circle sitting completely immobile with a bag around his neck, and he just stares at his money. The sodomite is in perpetual motion. He's on a desert, and every time his foot touches the sand, it burns the foot, so he's in perpetual motion. So they are mirror images of each other. But both, what they share is the fact that they're both unnatural.
This is, I hope, a non-awkward segue to what I wanted to ask you about Pythagoras and Plato, because it goes to emotion. We think of the word emotion, we don't look at the etymological roots of it. Emotion is motion. Plato said that love is the source of all motion. Did Plato have in mind something similar to gravity? Because you also talk about gravity as the primal force, gravity as a kind of love in the universe.
Yes, Dante said gravity was love. So you have this tradition. You have this tradition that begins with Plato, but we're familiar with it through Newton, because that's where we get the term gravity, and he had gravity and inertia, which he got from Empedocles, who was a philosopher, classical philosopher, who said that basically the universe was love and strife. Well, strife is inertia and love is gravity, because gravity is the force that holds everything together. And that Dante saw as a divine force, and that's what he saw as love. So the point here is, but after Descartes, everybody separates the things of the mind from the things of the universe. And the mind becomes this alien force in the universe. It becomes the ghost inside the machine, and nobody can explain how they're related. Well, that's because you've lost contact with Logos, because Logos is the link between the mind and the universe. And the mind can apprehend order in the universe because it was created by the same God who created the universe. So suddenly all these dilemmas, they all disappear.
Because Logos becomes the bridge between seemingly unbridgeable realities, time and eternity, change and permanence. That's the beginning of a long list of the mysteries that are solved in some way by the concept of Logos.
Well, the fundamental modern mystery is Descartes with the res extensa and the res cogitans. How are they related?
What are those res extensa and res cogitans for non-Latinists?
Res extensa means the extended thing or the universe, and the res cogitans is the thinking thing or the mind. So what's the relationship between the universe and the mind? Well, he can't explain it. The closest he comes is mathematics. And at that point, you start going down the road of science, because he became the philosopher of science. And at a certain point, mathematics becomes the shorthand for Logos for a certain group of people called scientists.
And even the word ology, every word that ends with the suffix ology, that's a nod to Logos, right?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
What is a good definition of science as opposed to Science Incorporated, or the fake science that gets thrown at us by people like Anthony Fauci?
Yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. And I cover this in my book because basically science arose at a certain period in human history. What you're talking about is natural science, which is basically the study of the universe. Now, we started off with that because Thales and those people, they were physicists. We were physiologoi. They were physicists. They were trying to study the universe because they got tired of the mythology of Homer, and they thought there's a better way to deal with this. And they reached a certain point, and then they had to stop because they didn't have instruments necessary to explore the universe in depth. So they had no telescope and they had no microscope. And so eventually, there's only so much you can do with the naked eye. And at that point, the Greeks lost interest and they switched to sophistry, which is basically, how can I win court cases and make money? And so you switch to rhetoric, and then Socrates came into being, and he started criticizing the sophists, and then that grew up again. So you have a whole different dimension here. Okay, and then, as I said, then there was an impasse, and nobody could reconcile Aristotle's God with Plato's God. And that's where it stood. Aristotle had one famous student, and his name was Alexander the Great, and he wasn't a philosopher. He just spread these ideas throughout the world by military conquest. And Jesus Christ was born into that world where people spoke Greek and sometimes Latin. And the revelation that we've already talked about of St. John about Jesus Christ was so powerful that nobody did anything else but theology. One exception, maybe Boethius, a throwback to the old philosophical era when he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy. But nobody did anything but theology because it was so stunning that we just have to think through the implications. And it took maybe 1,000 years. And so you'd have a book like Augustine's City of God, where he said that salamanders live in fire. I didn't really say that. He said some people say salamanders live in fire. It sounds plausible to me, and that's a way that you can explain the souls in purgatory, how you can live and not perish in the fire. Well, salamanders don't live in fire. But that nobody really looked into that for about 1,500 years. And then finally they realized, well, no, they live in logs. And if you take the log and you throw it on the fire, the salamander is going to come out and try and run away. And that's where you got the idea.
Yeah.
But I'm saying for the Christian revelation was so powerful that it postponed this examination of the physical universe for about 1,000 years. And then suddenly it came back, and it came back with a vengeance, because it came back at precisely the time that scholasticism is dying of its own internal problems, and people are killing each other in the name of Jesus Christ in the religious wars of the 17th century. And people say, I'm sick of it. I just want to talk about the universe. And you end up with people like Kepler, Galileo, all of those people. And that's where we had science. And science then took on the aura of ultimate authority, which is where we are today.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. That's where we are today, because what you have is Anthony Fauci ruling us with an iron rod and basically telling us that, abortion clinics are essential services that should remain open, but we have to close your churches. Well, that's complete tyrannical, and and the fact that the church capitulates to this is a sign that they've basically given up their claim to ultimate reality. They've simply capitulated to the scientists. This is not an exaggeration. There was an article in America Magazine, and the headline was, "I am a scientist. We must close our churches."
Right. In the name, that's the Science Inc. I'm talking about.
That's right. That's right.
And so you have this, the battle in the public consciousness sold by the mainstream media is that in the cosmic arm wrestle, science beat religion. Science is about objectivity and about truth and about facts. Religion is about feelings and subjectivity and opinions.
Absolutely. That's exactly the world that we live in. And that's the reason I wrote Logos Rising, because Logos is neither science nor feelings. It's neither one. I mean, not science in terms of that type of fact physics. It's not physics. It's not little balls bumping into each other. As the ultimate reality. That is clearly what Bertrand Russell believed. It's called atomism. He got it from Democritus. It's not a new idea, but he clearly felt that he was in touch with that ultimate reality, and he could tell you how to live your life because he knew about those little balls bumping into each other.
I was very entertained and edified by the 1948 BBC debate between Lord Bertrand Russell and Father Fred Copleston. It's a really interesting, I'm going to put it in the show notes at patrickcoffin.media. I'm not sure if you've seen it or listened to it rather, Dr. Jones, but it's quite a clash of titans. We're not talking about a Richard Dawkins soundbite in that particular argument. And it reminded me of a story I've heard you mention in other interviews. Don't think you get into it in Logos Rising. And that is your encounter with the teenage student in India. And you very, in a compressed way, summarized an easy to grasp proof for God's existence. Can you summarize? Can you go over that?
Yeah, it was. I was
turtles all the way down was the context.
I was in India. And it gave a little talk, and it was a 16-year-old boy, and he stood up, "Can you prove the existence of God?" I said, "Yes, I can." I said, "Nothing comes from nothing. There is something. Therefore, there was never nothing. This something could not bring itself into existence, because to do that, it would have to exist before it existed, and that's impossible. Therefore, something else had to bring it into existence, and that something is what all men call God." Now, Copleston gave a variation of that in his debate with Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell didn't know what to say. He was completely
he just ran out of gas and could only change the topic.
Yeah, that's right. So that's what led me to do that actual incident that happened in India.
It's a variation on the third way of Thomas Aquinas, the argument for contingency. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think
you can't have.
Good.
You can't have an infinite regress of contingent beings, and Ed Feser used the example of the train. Okay, you can ask, well, why is the caboose moving? Well, because the boxcar in front of it's moving. Well, why is that boxcar moving? Well, because the boxcar in front of it's moving. Well, can you have an infinite string of boxcars? No, because the boxcar can't move. So it depends on a locomotive. And the locomotive is moving because it is a locomotive and nothing else has to move it. That's what God is. And you have to have some type of end to a regress. You cannot have an infinite regress. You could have an infinite number of boxcars, but they still couldn't move because a boxcar can't move.
And they couldn't explain their own existence, that infinite series of boxcars. And I've interviewed Ed Feser on this. Ed's a very, very clear-thinking man. He emphasizes that the boxcars and caboose being moved by the engine, it's not just applicable to time and the past, where the beginning of history is somehow the train, or the purpose is the train engine, but it also applies to the present moment. Every present moment, including this particular present moment that you and I are having, and when the show airs, it's all dependent on the underlying continual will of God that we all continue to be, right? So it's not just horizontal, it's vertical. Does that make sense?
That's the ultimate motion, the ultimate source of motion. You could look at it the other way and talk about the lack of motion, but it's the same principle. So if you're going to build a bridge, you have to get a piling in the middle to hold the bridge up. Well, how do you do that? Well, you put a form around it, you pump the water out, and then there's mud there, and then you got to move through the mud till you find something that does not move, and that is the thing that does not move holds up everything else. That's what holds the bridge up. And so you can have an infinite amount of cement, but if you don't find something that doesn't move, you can't build a bridge. It's the same principle, and that was Aristotle called it the unmoved mover, the thing that everything else depends upon. And he said you cannot have an infinite regress. Well, India is sort of based on the infinite regress. It's the national symbol. I'm in a conversation. This is an internet conversation with another Indian, and we start talking about logos in India, or the absence thereof. And I said, well, it's like the symbol of the cosmos, the Indian symbol of the cosmos. The earth is a semicircle. It's sitting on 4 elephants, and the 4 elephants are standing on a turtle. So what's the turtle standing on? And the answer is turtles all the way down. But that's an infinite regress, and so that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And he converted to Catholicism because I said that.
Well, there's proof positive that that philosophy does have a role in Christian faith, because not everything is. We're not fideists. Sometimes the mind can stumble upon a truth that, if it's aided by God's grace, can produce conversion and the desire for baptism.
Yes, and I think that the church has always recognized this. And as I said before, you could not have the doctrine of the Trinity without philosophical speculation. You were given the fundament in Revelation, but you had to speculate on it using the categories of Greek philosophy in order to come up with the idea.
There's a growing number of young people in the internet space and probably elsewhere that read your books and counter the notion of logos as rising. One of them is my recent guest, Rush V, Valerie Rush Valizada, former pickup artist. This guy who wrote over 15 books on how to bed women around the world. And the void he was trying to fill with all this behavior got deeper and deeper. And that malaise took over until he reached out to Logos, to God, and God answered his prayers. What's it like to connect with people all over the world who discover the truth about Jesus Christ because of this notion of Logos?
Well, it's kind of, what should I say? Kind of combination of awe-inspiring and humbling. But it also confirms me in the understanding that this is a category of reality. This is not something I'm making up. I can't say something like this and have resonance all over the world if it didn't correspond to reality. And I think that that's precisely the point, that the people know that they have this power because they're rational creatures, and it's always being subverted one way or the other. One of the main ways to subvert it is the stimulation of passion, which blinds you to lust, darkens the mind. It blinds you to reality. And the fact that people can wake up from it like that, like Roosh did, is a testimony to the power of this term, the power of this idea.
And this idea is afoot even outside Christian circles. Look at the NoFap November and the rise of the NoFap community. These totally secular people. Some of them are atheists, and they realize, wait a second, if I misuse my sexual faculty, I'm going to ruin my life.
And when you say misuse, what you're saying, there is a proper use.
Right.
And when you're saying there's a proper use, then you're saying there is a logos to the human body. And that if you don't follow that logos, you're going to be unhappy. So in many ways, I wrote Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control. I wrote that 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. And everybody laughed when that book came out, if anybody reacted at all. And now suddenly you're in a situation where I don't have to convince young people in their 20s that the sexual liberation is a form of political control. They know that because they're addicted to pornography. And so when you come up with an explanation for that is based on the logos of the human body and the logos of the universe, they have a natural response and they say, yes, that's right. And they stop. Some people just stop because they understood the idea. That's what people have told me. I mean, it's a bad habit. You need grace generally to break bad habits. And I'm not denying that. But some people have told me as soon as I understood that, I stopped. And then suddenly you have these people coming together in last November and agreeing to boycott pornography. Well, where did that come from? I didn't organize it. It just happened because there's this spontaneous understanding that this violates the logos of sexuality, and I'm unhappy because I did it. And so they were denounced by Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
And they were called anti-Semites by Rolling Stone. Wait a minute, are you trying to tell me Jews are involved in pornography? Wait a minute, I wrote a book about that, and you didn't like that book, but now you're saying the same thing.
Recently, you did a video called God Has a Plan for Your Life. Maybe we can stop there because I definitely want to dig in part 2 when we go from the incarnation until last Tuesday in Logos Rising. Simple incident can happen to anyone. You're walking in an urban setting. It happened to be a bridge in South Bend, Indiana. There's a possibly homeless-looking black woman with a shopping bag full of her earthly goods, and she comes up to you. Just share that story because I think it goes to something really important, and that is the role of divine providence behind and beneath all of this.
Yeah, so it was raining. I can't row, so I'm taking a walk. And she approaches me and she says to me, do you have a cell phone? And as I said, I'm the only guy in South Bend who probably doesn't have a cell phone. I said, no, I'm sorry. And at that point, I'm ready to continue walking. And she says, I need to call my mama. I'm going to kill myself. And at that point, she hopped over the railing and stood on the ledge over the St. Joseph River, which was, I don't know, it's pretty far down there. The water is high, it's raging, and she's ready to jump in the river. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I tried to persuade her not to. And I said, God has a plan for your life. And we went back and forth, basically. She kept saying, nobody loves me. Mm-hmm. I'm going to kill myself. And I kept saying, God has a plan for your life. And it went back and forth. At one point, she grabs my umbrella and she's going to pull me into the river, and I'm pulling her back. And then finally, she walks over to the parapet, and nobody can reach her. At this point, the cops show up. And at this point, we've got an impasse. She keeps telling she's going to kill herself. The cops keep telling her she's going to give her a place to stay. And at that point, I said a prayer. I said the Memorare. Mm-hmm. And at that point, she walked back. And at that point, the cops grabbed her. And they brought her over, and so she didn't kill herself. And so she's got another chance now. They put her in a cop car. I've never seen her again. And so I began to speculate on it. I said, if I had left 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, I never would have run into this woman. This was a plan from all eternity. This is God's plan. And I had nothing to do with it. I just showed up at that moment. But at that moment, free will kicks in. And at that moment, I could have just pushed her aside and kept on walking, but I didn't. Or at that moment, she could have jumped across the railing and jumped into the river without talking to me. But she didn't. because part of the plan involves our free will and our behavior. And the fact that we are here to talk to each other as rational creatures and maybe persuade people not to do something that is bad, really bad, and will affect you for not just this life, but for eternity. But the other part of it is, at a certain point, you can actually pray and enter and have an effect on the outcome because you asked for some type of spiritual help. And you can say what you want. I think that the prayer had an effect on this woman because I think she stepped back. I know she stepped back after I said the prayer. You can say it's post hoc ergo propter hoc, but I think it had an effect. And so I think that's the whole story. In a nutshell, there is a divine plan. It is predetermined to some extent, but the predetermined, because it's already finished in God's mind. It's already over. It's in eternity. There's no such thing as over or before. It's eternity. Mm-hmm. It's in God's mind. But everything that happened according to free will. And the free will involves invoking God's help because God is a part of this universe because of the incarnation. And he does listen to our prayers and he answers them. And so that was the whole meaning that I saw in this chance encounter.
So the answer to the question, which is more powerful, free will of human beings or the divine will of God, the answer is yes.
Yes. They're not mutually exclusive. The Muslims think they are. So I met a man in Tehran whose father, a father of his friend said that he believed that everything was fate. And so he believed that if Allah willed it, you would die. And so he walked out into traffic without thinking. If Allah wills it, I'm going to die. If Allah wills it, I will get safely across. And so guess what happened? He got hit by a car because you're violating reason. God gave you reason in addition to giving you everything else. And reason allows you to make judgments about this universe that are accurate and worth following because there's a logos in the universe that corresponds to the logos in your mind like a key to a lock. Your mind is the key that can unlock the universe because both share in logos.
That's a good place to put a comma or an ellipses. We'll set up for part 2 where we're going to talk about Paul and the philosophers, the incarnation, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the foundation of the church, the history and rise of science, fascinating chapter on Hegel. The Hegel chapter could be a book unto itself, all the way up to Annus Mirabilis, 1979. That's in part 2. Look forward to it, E. Michael Jones.
Thanks, Patrick. It's always a pleasure.
As promised, part 2 of a 2-part series on Logos Rising, the very readable, accessible tome by my guest, Dr. E. Michael Jones, editor of Culture Wars magazine. Go to culturewars.com to find out more. He's also the author of Degenerate Moderns, Modernity as Rationalized Sexual Misbehavior, Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, Slaughter of Cities, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History, Living Machines, Barren Metal, and his latest book, as we mentioned, Logos Rising. I'll just flash it for the camera. History of Ultimate Reality. Dr. E. Michael Jones, welcome back.
Thank you, Patrick. Good to be back.
Last week we covered the beginning of everything, and you took apart the arguments of people like Daniel Dennett and the late Chris Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. Did I miss one? Chris Hitchens? Yeah, Richard Dawkins, that's right, the retired microbiologist. And then we talked about the origin of the concept, logos, the Greek word that's so rich in meaning, first mentioned or popularized by Heraclitus. And I thought we would go from creation to the logos incarnate and then take the narrative up from there. Fair enough?
Sure.
This is so much to cover. This could easily be a 14-part series.
Yes.
Okay, maybe we can start with John 1, verse 1, which compresses so much into a few words. We mentioned that as well. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that English word it's kind of lightweight considering the weighty nature of what St. John's laying out here. And part of your thesis here is that this is providential, that the Greeks had this concept of logos as intellect, design, order, speech. It's like the gospel and the incarnation itself was being prepared in some way by these ideas in Greek philosophy.
That's right. And we shouldn't hold that in contempt, because the church did not hold it in contempt. There are people out there who said, oh, that's all that Catholicism does is baptize some type of paganism. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what you're really saying there is that God the Father prepared the way for the arrival of God the Son on this earth by leaving in creation what we would call the logos spermatikoi, seminal words. And we know from St. Paul that you can show that God exists without believing in faith at all. You don't need faith at all. Reason can prove that God exists. But the church fathers went farther than that. They said you could find evidence of the Trinity in creation if you looked hard enough, and there were people who did exactly that. And that's precisely where we start now with John. I speculate here that John was aware. John, the Blessed Mother, and Paul were all in Ephesus around the same time. I suspect that John knew about Paul's failure at the Areopagus, tried to introduce Jesus Christ to the Greek-speaking world and didn't go well. For the most part, as soon as he said this man rose from the dead, they all said, well, we'll talk about that some other time. I got something important to do now. We'll see you later. And he got 2 converts and then left for Corinth, where he got a good reception with the whores and the sailors. But the church didn't get started for another 500 years in Athens. He didn't make that connection. And I think John knew that. And I think he knew that if you're going to speak to the Greek-speaking world, there's no point in giving Hebrew genealogies because they don't know who these people are. And so he started with a way of addressing the Greeks. And they're the 3 sentences that you just mentioned at the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. This is addressing a philosophical audience, an audience whose language was the basis for their philosophy and whose philosophy was intimately bound up with their language. And one of the crucial words was logos, which means order and all of the stuff that we've talked about. Or every word that ends in ology relates back to logos in one way or another. But this is new. That was kind of metaphysics, and anybody could understand that if they spoke Greek and were familiar with Greek history and philosophy. But he brought up something new because he started talking about the logos as the Son. The Son and the Logos were the same being. Mm-hmm. So it's not just geometry. It's not just physics. It's a person. This plan is dynamic, and the closest we can come to that is Heraclitus' understanding of fire, because fire is always in motion, but it's always the same. And so what you have now is the Logos is a person. Logos is God. And that means that this plan has a dimension in time. It means that there is a person who is going to bring this plan to fulfillment in human history. And suddenly you change everyone's. You don't repudiate the past. You expand the past. You expand it to a new dimension that builds on the past of what you know, but expands it way beyond anything you could ever thought of. Resolving the conflict in Greek philosophy between the unmoved mover and the demiurgos, between transcendence and immanence, because now it's all located in one person, and that person is the vehicle of logos in human history. Mm-hmm. And that is such a stunning new revelation that it took about 1,200 years to digest it.
Bishop Sheen, yeah.
So John killed, in many ways, he killed philosophy. If he didn't kill it, St. Augustine is the one who killed it because he was familiar with it and said, there's no point in trying it anymore. This is something new. We're going to have to figure this out.
Killed it in the sense of put it on its proper footing and framing it within its limitations.
He expanded it. He opened up so much new territory here that we had to sort of colonize that territory before he could get back to what the original project was. And I think it took about, I'm saying it took about, from the Gospel of John, it took about 1,200 years to finally get back to. Now there was Boethius was in the middle of that, and he did philosophy, but he was the exception that proved the rule, because everybody after that did theology. They did theology.
There's a very interesting conversation in around 1976 or 7 with then Bishop Sheen, who had been retired for 10 years, and Malcolm Muggeridge. Muggeridge was still an Anglican at that point, and they talk about Paul's failure. Just to jump back a little bit to Acts 17 at the Areopagus, Paul speaking at Mars Hill, right? And it was really Paul's only evangelical failure, because he didn't hit the rapprochement. He didn't really mention the cross. He kind of got to the starting gate and left the race before the shot was fired, which is
right.
In a way counterintuitive. Go ahead.
He was a man who was in a hurry. He was in a hurry. And I'm going to, he buttonholes you and says, I'm going to tell you some stuff. This is really important. Now you pay attention, and I've only got 15 minutes, but I'm going to, that's kind of the way, because he had to get someplace else. He was always heading someplace else.
Yeah.
And I think he was in too much of a hurry at this point.
He's like Jesus in Mark's gospel. He's always, and then he went, and then he went, and then he went, and then he went. The image of fire by Heraclitus, it's kind of a brilliant image. To me, it's the closest one. And I believe you mentioned the church fathers. Don't some of the church fathers liken the fire that burns the bush but doesn't consume it as a kind of prototype of Jesus the Son, or Christ's divinity?
Probole. There's a Greek word, probole, and it applies to light. And so the fact that the sun can give off light, but that never it never runs out of light to give off. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And they talked about this as a kind of this sun emanating from the Father in the way that light emanates from the sun. And it actually got into the creed, light from light, true God from true God. So that was a metaphor that they used to explain how you could be kind of the same thing and yet different at the same time. So, of course, what we're talking about here is the Trinity. And that was the big problem right after that. St. John gave us the kind of basic tools, the basic building blocks out of Revelation. And then for the next about 3 centuries, let's say to 325, the Council of Nicaea, they sat around thinking, how do these parts fit together? And again, they couldn't have done it without Greek. They could not have done it without the Greek language. And in many ways, the Western fathers were innocent of heresy, largely because they couldn't understand Greek. And so they were kind of cut out of the discussion, because to get involved in the heresy, you had to know the difference between homoousion and homoiousion, which came to be the second was the Arian formula that they tried to superimpose over the Orthodox formula of homoousion. One in being with the Father, consubstantial with the Father. That's what it meant. That's what it meant. So the whole thing, it's basically one large debate in Greek philosophy that was necessary in order to be able to understand the Trinity in some type of systematic fashion, so that you could come up with a creed that was an accurate representation of what you believed.
I wanted to ask you about the particularity of the Logos incarnate. You in Logos Rising, you quote from the Roman Martyrology, and I'd never seen this text put in one spot. Normally I'm allergic to reading, but here it is. This is the Roman Martyrology that dates Christ's birth as the 25th of December. When ages beyond number had run their course from the creation of the world, when God in the beginning created heaven and earth and formed man in his own likeness, when century upon century had passed since the Almighty set his bow in the clouds after the great flood, as a sign of covenant and peace, in the 21st century since Abraham, our father in faith, came out of Ur of the Chaldees, in the 13th century since the people of Israel were led by Moses in the exodus from Egypt, around the 1000th year since David was anointed king, in the 65th week of the prophecy of Daniel, in the 194th Olympiad, in the year 752 since the foundation of the city of Rome, in the 42nd year of the reign of Caesar Octavian Augustus, when the world was at peace. That is a piece of prose right there. Why all this detail? Why this sense of we have to locate this not just as a Greek philosophical idea, but something that happened historically?
Because the danger is that someone's going to say it's a myth. And the big breakthrough in Greece was the move away from myth. And there are other areas of the world where they never did it, never moved away from myth. If you tried, Indians, when they write philosophy, it always ends up with some type of superhero in mythology. So they were very careful about wanting to situate this in a historical context, an accurate historical context that everyone would recognize. So it's not just the Hebrew scripture, it's the Greek Olympiad and the Ab Orbe Condita, the founding of Rome, so that you know exactly what we're talking about when this happened. And
Christ did not appear in Athens or Jerusalem or Rome or any of the great urban cosmopolitan centers, but backwoods hick area.
Right.
Is there a takeaway from that?
Just that he was not going to be the powerful military ruler that the Hebrews wanted. He was not going to be like David. It was not going to be that way. And that became the big stumbling block among the Jews, who would have preferred a powerful military leader. This was completely different. But it is Logos, and Logos does have some type of power. But you have to have the eyes to see it, to recognize it. And that meant that you were not, he's dealing with Hebrew chauvinism here. And probably the best example of Hebrew chauvinism is the Gospel of St. John, where the Jews say to Jesus, we're the seed of Abraham. And Jesus said, it doesn't matter. God could raise up stones. And so they had to bring in, to deflate Jewish hubris, they had to bring in the Olympiad and the history of Rome and all of these, because that was important too. Not so much as to situate it, but there are other people. God has taken contributions from other parts of humanity as well. So don't get too uppity. And that became the breaking point.
There's the notion of humility too. He didn't come onto a superstar platform, but an unknown spot that was, if anything, didn't have a good reputation. Can anything good come from Nazareth, right?
Right. But on the other hand, he was receptive. The first non-Jews to see Jesus Christ were Persian astronomers and philosophers. Astronomy and philosophy were intimately linked at that point, because they felt that God dwelled in the heavens, and that the mechanism whereby he communicated his will with the spheres, the celestial spheres. And that's why astrology was important. And astrology and astronomy were sort of the same thing at that point in time.
So over time, the next couple of centuries, when John 1, verse 1 and following gets fleshed out, and we get the formulation of the dogma of the Trinity and the relationship between the human nature and the divine nature of Jesus Christ, and all the foundation of the sacraments and all that. And then we have this great figure, St. Augustine. And you devote a lot of time in Libido Dominandi, which is a phrase from City of God, I believe. Here in Logos Rising, you say Augustine is, in a way, is the one who discovered time.
Christopher Dawson said that, and I just appropriated because that is true. Because he was a Platonist as a young man. Then he became a Manichaean and got involved in all of these mystery cults in that time of the Roman Empire. But as a Platonist, time had no meaning. Aristotle said time was the number of motion. And that's kind of like the clock. It goes around in a circle and it really doesn't go anywhere, and it doesn't really have any meaning. And that's the time of scientific measurement, and that's the time we use, okay? It's the number of motion. But he has a really sophisticated understanding of time that is really complicated in the City of God, which has to do with memory and expectation and goes deep into the psychological perception of time. But he also, the point of the book is that there is a plan for human history. Now, the only people who ever felt that way were the Hebrews. So this is a new concept to Greece, because you can have people like Herodotus, who just, interesting stories. If someone said it, he wrote it down. Not really true. We're not going to look into it, but it was just a lot of interesting stories. But there's no sense that there's some type of plan for human history. And that was the contribution of Augustine, because he saw that in Christianity and was the one who made it explicit.
Is the missing ingredient here telos? Like a pole, an engine, a drive, a purpose, a point? What is telos for the uninitiated?
Telos is, Aristotle used that term, and it means end or goal. And it means that all action has an end, a purpose. You don't act unless you have some type of purpose in mind. And that purpose is then the end or the end point or goal of what you're doing. So he could see that with individual action, with animals. They all have act for a purpose, but he couldn't see it for history, because nobody did. There were certain, he was the greatest il maestro de color che sanno, the master of all those who know, as Dante called him. But he had limitations because of his time and place. And there were things that he didn't know. And one of the things he didn't know was that actually history had a purpose too. And that's what St. Augustine added to Greek philosophy. It's implicit if in Hebrew history. Obviously, it's salvation history. The Hebrew revelation is over time, and it's basically the story of the Hebrew people and how they were given the covenant and how they violated the covenant and went back and forth. So they got the history right, but it was the Greeks who could understand the kind of the metaphysical implications of history. And Augustine brought them together and says, yes, there's a purpose to history. And history has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So Aristotle knew that there was, that's when he wrote the Poetics, he said the drama has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But he didn't know that history had one, because he didn't know that there was going to be an incarnation, that there was going to be a logos, that God was going to enter into history, because his God did not enter into history. Mm-hmm. His God was the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover that lived completely in a transcendent realm. And if maybe through the motion of the spheres it was communicated, but we couldn't be sure.
What is the nature of the two cities, city of man and city of God?
City of man is love of self to the extinction of God, and the city of God is love of God to the extinction of self. And those are the two options in human history. And nothing will change in that regard. And history will be the rise and fall of empires that either embody one or the other ideal, or generally what it is, you start off embodying one and you end up embodying the other. And decadence sets in and the empire fails and collapses. The man who talked about that is Vico. And there's a chapter on him, but that's getting ahead of the story.
Yeah. Let's move to the rise of Islam and the separation a couple of centuries later. I've interviewed Robert Riley on his book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, and I learned a lot about, and you talk about it in Logos Rising, the Mutazilite and the more anti-rational Asherites. One sees Allah as pure will, and he's totally capricious, he can lie and so on, and the other is more akin to Christian philosophy. When did that split happen within Islam?
Well, it started as the Muslims were the first to get Aristotle's text. The Christianity had some texts from Plato, largely through Boethius, the translation, but it was the Muslims who had Aristotle, and they were just confronted with a dichotomy here, because Aristotle said the world was eternal and Islam said it was created, because they got their idea from Genesis. That's where the Muslims got their idea. And so you have this conflict, and how are we going to resolve the conflict? Now, I try to portray this as a conflict, an internal conflict between Arabia and Persia. That's kind of the way I see the development of Islam. The Arabs, even up till the 1970s, 85% of Saudi Arabia earned its living from animal husbandry. So that was camels and goats. And 2,500 years ago, the Persians or the Iranians were philosophers. As I said, the three people that three first non-Hebrews to see Jesus Christ were Persian philosophers. So they had a head start, and they considered themselves a superior culture. And they were. It was a superior culture. But unfortunately, they lost the war. And the Arabs were mobilized by this epic, this national epic called the Quran. It's the Arabic national epic. It's like the Aeneid was to the Romans, or the Nibelungenlied to the Germanic tribes, and El Cid to the Spaniards. And it energizes and unifies this group of people, and they become extremely powerful militarily, and they go out and conquer the world. And part of the world they conquered was Persia. And so at this point, you have a conflict. There are plenty, part of this was my experience going to Iran and dealing with the Iranians, talking to them. And then talking, off the record to people, and what was your experience? And the experience is, the one thing the Iranians prize is poetry. They have some of the greatest poetry in the world. Hafez, for example. I visited his tomb in Shiraz when I was there. Goethe thought he was so great that he tried to imitate Hafez. So the Persian children memorize Hafez's poetry, other poetry as well. Ferdowsi. Mm-hmm. Ferdowsi wrote a long epic called the Shahnameh. And they memorize it and they read it, but they only read excerpts because it's so long. And then at some point they go to the bazaar and they pick up the unexpurgated edition, and suddenly you open it, and Ferdowsi thinks that the worst thing that ever happened to Iran was Islam. We were conquered by barbarians. We're poets and philosophers, and these camel jockeys came in and destroyed our culture. And what are we going to do about it? All I can do is cry tears. And so this is part of the consciousness of the Persian people to this day. And as a result, there's this uneasiness that I noticed. Because when you talk to them, I've been in a situation where you talk to the mullah, and the mullah is just this ferocious advocate of sola scriptura. So, I tried to talk about, let's talk about the wheel. Let's talk about the dog. How was the dog domesticated? I'm trying to explain this because I'm in Mashhad. This is on the Eurasian plain. This is where the horse, the wheel, all these things. And he said, no, that's wrong. I said, what do you mean it's wrong? He said, a prophet explained it. A prophet? I said, what do you mean? Islam is like it's like 10,000 years in the future. We've had dogs and wheels, domesticated dogs for 10,000 years. For 10,000 BC. No, everything comes from the Quran, because the Quran is the source of all knowledge. And so if it doesn't come from the Quran, it comes from the Hadith. And the Hadith are created to make up the gaps in the Quran. And so as a result, you have this anti-intellectual superstructure imposed on the Persian mind, and it just doesn't fit. And it just doesn't fit.
These are the anti-rational Asherite Muslims for whom you said it's like sola scriptura. Could you say
this triumphed? And
yeah, I wanted to ask about sola scriptura.
The Mutassilites did not succeed. They did not. They were eventually extinguished.
Could you say
so you had tragic figures in Islamic history who try and kind of make some type of connection between faith and reason, and they end up getting their heads chopped off more than not. It just does not take. Islam always reverts to some type of Asherite, some type of fundamentalism.
And could you say it doubles down in a more extreme direction from sola scriptura by identifying the Quran with Allah himself? that the Quran is kind of eternalized.
Well, they have what is going to be a very difficult a notion of divine revelation that is going to be very difficult to defend. So their concept of divine revelation is that the angel Gabriel came down from heaven where the Quran exists. The book is actually in heaven. He came down and he dictated it into the ear of the prophet, who then wrote it down word for word, even though he was illiterate and didn't know how to write. Now, okay, that's really a strong claim.
Yeah.
And the problem is that now scripture scholarship is being applied to the Quran. And what you start to realize is that, well, no, these were passages that were all picked up elsewhere. How do you square that with this dictation into Muhammad's ear? So just to give you one instance, I was invited to talk about, in Tehran, I was invited to talk about mercy, about the first surah of the Quran. So I contact my friend at the University of Warsaw in Poland, who's an Islamic scholar, and I said, where does this come from? It doesn't seem like a beginning. He says it's not. It's a Syriac Christian prayer. So how are you going to square this with the notion that I've already expressed of revelation? How are you going to make these two things come together? I don't think you can. And I think they know that, and as a result, there's always going to be some type of reversion to a type of fundamentalism because it can't withstand the rational scrutiny in the way that the Bible can.
And that's
the problem.
Yeah. This insight here seems to be the one that got then Pope Benedict XVI in so much trouble after his speech at Regensburg, identifying the disconnect between reason and revelation leading to an impulse toward violence. And in response, there were violent reactions around the world. Is this disconnect between Logos as God and the interface between human reason and what God can reveal, is that behind the fact that science did not arise from the Islamic world?
Yes, that's what. The big puzzle about the Islamic world is, why didn't science arise there? Because they had a huge head start compared to Europe. Huge head start. Why didn't it arise there? Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, I mean, the point of my book is, well, because you didn't understand the Trinity. Because you got your notion of Jesus Christ from Nestorian heretics, because they're the only people who were around in what became the Islamic world. And they didn't believe that Jesus Christ was God. So it's a concept that came from revelation. It was articulated through Greek philosophy, but once it became articulated, you had to get with the plan, because if you didn't, history left you behind, and that's precisely what happened to Islam. They were left behind. I mean, there were heroic figures like Averroes, heroic effort to basically square the circle and unite revelation with philosophy, but the revelation you're using is the Quran, which is not a complete form of revelation. It's kind of like, it's a truncated form. It's a distorted form. I think the best image I got was basically the Arabians are in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the gospel has already been preached on the Hejaz, which is the the eastern bank of the Red Sea, in Syriac. But it's never been translated into Arabic. And so you have these guys hearing these stories, like from afar, like the caravans coming through, and there's this great story. It's about Jesus. He manna from heaven. It's incredible. It's the Eucharist. And so I'm thinking, what is all this? They're trying to put it together, and they come up with the story of the flying table. The flying table. What is that? Well, it's their kind of trying to understand the gospel from afar through kind of broken translation, and it's the Eucharist. It's a combination of manna and the Eucharist.
It's interesting.
The Eucharist is manna.
Like a game of telephone. Yeah, by the time it gets to the end.
That's easy. And I'm saying that, well, they had no concept of Logos. Because let's face it, we don't have a concept of Logos either. We have the word, which is very truncated. So they didn't. So what did they come up with? Well, it's the book. Logos is a book, and the book is the Quran, and all knowledge is in the Quran. Well, that's a kind of a mishearing of the word logos. You know what I mean? It's a kind of these are people who think in very specific, concrete terms, and they didn't have the centuries of Greek philosophy to allow them to come to be comfortable with abstractions. They didn't have it.
This people of the book thing sounds like a post Nostra Aetate bit of modernist word salad. Catholics are not people of the book, right? We're people of the we're people of the person.
Sola Scriptura. If
right.
you mean Sola Scriptura, it's never been that. We've never believed in Sola Scriptura. In many ways it's a Muslim concept, and Luther picked it up and he imposed it on the West with disastrous results.
Do you think Islam with Heller Balak comes down to a kind of complex heresy?
Yes, it certainly derived from heresy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I point out in the chapter on Augustine is basically Catholicism died when Augustine died. It died in North Africa. It was the Augustine was using the police power of the Roman Empire to keep the Donatists in check. The Donatists were Judaizers. There was a Judaizing sect, which is always a danger to Catholicism, always a danger to Christianity, like Christian Zionists today. And they found it more plausible because they liked the idea of being a separate people, which is what the Jews liked. And so Augustine uses the Roman soldiery, the police power to keep them in check. And then the empire collapses and the Donatists take over. It's over. That's the end of Catholicism. We have no idea of how threatened the church was at this point because the entire East succumbed to heresy. And then because they were weakened by heresy, Islam took root there because Islam grew out of the Nestorian heresy.
I hope Christians in America pay attention to this because I keep saying that there's a certain kind of American conservative that's very rah-rah for the United States. And the United States is a great country, but it's not. It wasn't promised the Holy Spirit, and it wasn't created without original sin. As the church, which was strong in Augustine's day, is now, a goner, the same thing could happen to the church in the West, right? That's one of the premises of your book.
It happened in North Africa. That's for sure. It did happen in North Africa, which was one of the most vibrant centers of the church. If it weren't for Alexandria, we would not have the Trinity. Mm-hmm. Alexandria was a bastion of orthodoxy, Catholic orthodoxy, and Antioch was the antithesis. It was a hotbed of Judaizing. St. John Chrysostom was in Antioch when he wrote Adversus Judaeos because it was infected with Judaizing.
Meaning wanting to return to the old rites that had been fulfilled in Christ?
Right. Sensual, carnal religion. The biggest problem in Chrysostom's day was Jewish services with musical extravaganzas. And the unwitting Christians were just lured because they wanted to hear music. And they loved this kind of spectacle and blah, blah, blah. It was carnal religion. And Newman says it predisposed them to be incapable of understanding the Trinity. They got used to carnal religion. And so you couldn't think outside the then box of basically monotheism.
It sounds like the gay Broadway ballads that ruin Catholic worship music today. Impossible to sing, kind of itchy ears Broadway sound.
Do you want, like, even the motu proprio on sacred music that Pius X wrote in about 1907, I believe. Mm-hmm. He said, look, I love Verdi, but it's not appropriate for Mass.
Yeah.
It's great music, but that's not the point. It's not the point here to have great music. The point here is to serve the Mass, have the music serve a higher goal and tell us. And for that, well, how about Palestrina? He's good. So he kind of made Palestrina the Thomas Aquinas of liturgical music.
We're going to get back to Thomas Aquinas and Leo XIII in a minute. But Pope St. Pius X, he did his best, but he had no exposure to the St. Louis Jesuits. So, you know. All right. So
Yes.
I one of my first podcast interviews was with a guy, I believe he was a Sunni Muslim. His Christian name is Mario Joseph. And Mario was studying to be an imam in India. And he was converted to Christ and ultimately to the Catholic Church, not from a preacher, not from a radio show or the New Testament, but by reading the Quran. And what got Mario interested is this notion of the word. The Quran uses the phrase word of God several times. So he goes to his mentor and he asks these pointed questions about if Allah is one, but Allah has a word, doesn't that imply at least two? And his mentor took a strip off him, screamed at him, and so on. To make a long story slightly longer, Mario's brothers and father pinned him down and tortured him until he renounced Christ. And the story's told. I'll try to put a link in there. But it goes to show that there is a kind of a nascent idea of logos in the Quran itself, even though there's these recommendations to violence. It's there in a seed form.
Yes, there's a huge conflict here over the roots of the Quran. And one of the Iranian ladies that I spent, she was really interested in that and talked about the fact that it's very difficult to find old Qurans because they were burned. So in many ways, the history of Iran is libraries being burned to the ground. And of course, Hegel took that in his history and talked about the story of the Library of Alexandria. Mm-hmm. And when the Muslim conqueror arrives, he asks the question, is this library either, the books in the library either say the same thing as the Quran, in which case they are superfluous, or they contradict the Quran, in which case they are heretical. But in both cases, we're going to burn it to the ground. Mm-hmm. Now, as soon as I say that, my Muslim friends jump up and say, he never, that's blah, blah, blah. But it was a story that got told in Egypt for a long time. And even if it's not true exactly of the Library of Alexandria, that's the history of Persia. Persia is a tragic story in many ways because they're on that great pathway out of the Eurasian plain, and everybody kind of marches through here. And the first thing they do when they get here is burn down your library. So there's a kind of tragedy here. And this is... Where were we going? I've lost. Where are we going with this?
I asked about the nascent sense of word, aka logos, right, in the Quran itself, and you were saying there's a controversy about the very foundation.
Right, and so basically, what you had is there were all of these competing versions of the Quran, and the Caliph, at a certain point, announces that. We're going to limit them to 7 versions or 9 versions, I forget which. Now, the Caliph imposed this on the book. And so, in many ways, it's God is an exalted Caliph who has power and imposes his will by force majeure. Mm-hmm. And that's supposed to resolve the question. Well, it doesn't resolve the question. And burning the Quran is not going to resolve this source problem, and that's what we're dealing with now. We're going to have to the Islam was off in the desert by itself for centuries, and now, thanks to our neoconservative friends, the United States has to invade that group, and they're going to conquer Islam to make the world safe for Israel. And as a result, they bring this ferment, this intellectual ferment, that they're going to have to go through. They're just going to have to go through it.
Well, certainly this American empire's addiction to democracy as a kind of Shangri-La, heaven and earth, is heavily problematic. I wanted to ask you about this impulse to book burn, because that's doubling down on this irrationalist spirit. If your desire to book burn is so powerful that you're willing to burn your own holy book, that's a snapshot of irrationality.
Well, I mean, look at the birth of Christianity. For, let's say, 300 years, let's say to 312, which is when Constantine made it the Catholicism the official religion of the Roman Empire. Three centuries where all you have to do is debate. You don't have any responsibility, any governing responsibility. So we're going to have a long debate, and you have the basis in the Greek language. You've got a sophisticated language you can work with. You got the greatest minds, and we can come up with the Trinity. And now finally, it's almost the same time. So 325 is Nicaea, 312 Constantine makes it. So within 13 years, all right, we nailed the Trinity down, and now we're ready to start ruling the empire. And in effect, you have to do that after 410 because the empire collapsed. So it was great. It worked out fine. Obviously, lots of conflict. But if you compare that to Islam, it's completely different. So you've got a group of people who are now going to impose Arabic, which is not a sophisticated language like Greek. You're going to impose this on conquered nations which are superior to you, like Persia. And you've got no debate because you're involved in warfare from the beginning. And you're conquering everybody, and now you've got to set up some type of administration all within, decades. And it's not working. I mean, the whole point of Shia Islam is that they wish that they had been there when the wicked Caliph Yazid had murdered Ali. Mm-hmm. And so you have this split, and I think it's the split between Persia and Arabia. It's a split between the descendants. Should they have lineal descendants, like actually Muhammad's progeny, or should it be the Caliph? Well, the Caliph won, and he killed off the Prophet's grandson, and as a result, the Caliph is in charge, and the Caliph solves things by burning books. He's got 9 versions. They contradict each other, sorry, but they're all right even when they contradict each other because I said so, and I'm the Caliph. And that has had an impact on Islam to this day.
And the Caliph is a kind of a vicar of Allah who himself is capricious and contradictory because he's pure will.
Well, what you're doing is projecting the Caliph onto God. Mm-hmm. So God is an exalted Caliph. And so Maimonides said this, and the Jewish philosopher in the Middle Ages said that God is a Caliph who goes for an afternoon ride in his carriage, and when he gets to the gate, he doesn't know whether he's going to go right or left. So he doesn't know. God doesn't know. It's pure will. There's no logos here. Mm-hmm. It's pure will. And so your job is to submit to this inscrutable will of God. And that's it, period. Well, that's not conducive to science. And that's precisely what happened. And that leads into the whole issue of Aquinas and Averroism and the rise of science in the West. Mm-hmm. Because you can't, as I said, with that mullah I'm talking to, well, wait a minute, you can figure this out. Maybe they just threw bones to the dogs and the dog came close to the fire and gradually, no, it's a prophet. Everything has to come from Scripture. So then they take me, I go from Mashhad, now I'm going on a tour in Golistan, and they take me to an enzyme factory. Well, I felt like going back to, I didn't see Naziri after that, but I felt like going back to him and saying, did the Prophet tell these people at the University of Golistan how to create an enzyme factory? That's not what the people told me. One guy told me, well, I'm a chemistry professor, and I had a friend who was good at raising money, and we got together, and that's why we have the enzyme factory. Where was the Prophet?
Right.
It's not there.
Well, that's the admission of I do. That's the admission of secondary causes, which is the basis of science.
That's exactly the point. That there's no secondary causality in Islam. Everything is done by the sovereign will of God, including your actions. Your actions. So if there's no secondary causality, are you going to have the patience? This is Stanley Yaki's example, or like Herschel, the astronomer. Are you going to have the patience to sit there night after night and watch these little blips move around in the sky and try and figure that out if there's no rationality behind it? No, you're not.
Right.
You're not.
Let me kick the tires of this a little bit. And it's a kind of a devil's advocate question. And if I don't ask it, people say, "Why didn't you ask him about this?" The knock on you is that your criticisms of Jews that are involved on the wrong side of Logos. And there's a long list, so you've enumerated them in other interviews and in other books. Why couldn't it be that the Jewish people, God's people, by virtue of their announcing and successfully delivering the Messiah, are on the side of Logos? It's incomplete because they don't have the Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ, but they did give the world monotheism and the moral law and the transcendence and the Ten Commandments. Why can't it be that the Jews are incomplete and it's the Muslims who are more anti-Logos? I mean, you can't open a newspaper without seeing some thug blowing himself up or killing innocent people or going on some rampage. You see the basis of my objection?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was the answer is that the Jews rejected Logos. The Muslims never learned Logos. They never picked it up. They never had it. They are a-Logos. It's the difference between rejection and ignorance, and that's a big difference.
What about rejection in the form of domesticating it and making Jesus into a Nestorian or Arian Jehovah's Witness kind of nice guy who is like Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, and what is that? It's Judaizing. So in a sense, you're going back. This is Newman. Newman wrote a brilliant book about Arianism in the 4th century. And he's brilliant because he talks about the role the Jews played. Now, this is pre-Holocaust. It's not America. There's no ADL around. And he's just being frank and saying this was all Judaizing heresy. The Jews were at the heart of every revolutionary heretical movement of that age. And so later, Rabbi Louis Israel Neumann says exactly the same thing in a book he wrote. So we're agreeing. The Jews were behind these heretical movements. They had rejected Logos. They were furious in their rejection of Logos. They had become revolutionaries. Simon Bar Kokhba, 135, a furious revolutionary who basically said, if you don't have the Jewish revolutionary spirit, we're kicking you out. You're not a real Jew. This is the type of antagonism that the Jews had toward Logos, which you do not find in Islam. They just didn't have it to begin with. And if you don't have it to begin with, you can't reject it.
What about the Protestant revolt? In what way was that a representative of the forces of anti-Logos? Or do I have it exactly wrong?
First of all, let's clear the air here. The Reformation in England had nothing to do with theology whatsoever. It was a looting operation, pure and simple. And then there was a little bit of holy water or theology sprinkled on it to justify it after the fact. Okay, every Protestant country was a looting operation because the aristocrats wanted church property. No exceptions here. And Germany was no exception to this rule. But Germany had a guy named Luther who came up with some type of justification.
Father Martin Luther.
He's a priest, okay, and he was a man who could not control his passions. You probably read that chapter in Degenerate Moderns.
Yeah, Luther's Legacy, worth the price.
Luther's Legacy, right? And so he's a man who has trouble controlling his passions. He breaks with the church. The aristocrats spirit him off to the Wartburg. He's just being tortured by lust. And finally, he capitulates and he marries. They were breaking into convents, and this was women's liberation. And you drag the nuns out, and then you offer them to the Archbishop of Mainz or something like that, if he joins the Lutheran party. And so Luther finally had to succumb to it himself, and he married Katharina von Bora, whose nickname was Käthe, and he called her Kette, which is the German word for chain. And at this point, he wrote the enslaved will. And at this point,
accidentally autobiographical about his marriage. Is that where ball and chain comes from? The Hallmark card image of marriage as a ball and chain. I wonder if it's from Luther's wife.
Her other name, he called her catena in Latin, which is the Latin word for chain. And so he'd write to other ex-priests and say, my chain greets your chain. In other words, the enslaved will turned In other words, he could not deal with the guilt anymore. And so he had to blame God. God did it. So now we're back to Islam and fate. I had to do it. And once you take this step, you hate reason. Because what is the fundamental reason we deal with every day? It's practical reason, which is known as morality. And here is his conscience accusing him. And how does he deal with his conscience? You broke your vows. You have no right to be sleeping with this woman. Who do you think you are? And he says, God made me do it. The will is enslaved.
Kind of like the reverse of theology of Flip Wilson. Not the devil, but God made me do it.
Right. And it had, as you know, it had consequences for Hegel as well. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves here.
True or false, Luther really did say that reason is the devil's whore.
Yes, he said that. He was very explicit. And he hated philosophy. He hated Aristotle. He hated philosophy. And at this point, what you had was the breaking apart of the Thomistic synthesis.
Could you say the word synthesis?
Breaking apart.
The synthesis is a pretty magnificent synonym for Thomism?
Yes. It's faith and reason. Faith and reason. You cannot have one. You need both of them. And so what you had here was Luther, sola fide, faith alone. Reason's a whore. It's just faith. And this flowed from the Devotio Moderna, which flowed from nominalism. And nominalism had a huge following in Germany. All the Germans were nominalists. William of Ockham, an Englishman, fled to Munich because he was on the lam. He needed to get away from church authorities. And I ate dinner at the monastery where he died of the plague. Not a very appetizing
That's making
prospect,
me hungry. Making me hungry now. So what is nominalism? Definition of nominalism as opposed to the remedy that Thomas Aquinas proposes?
Universals exist in the mind, and that led to German idealism. Direct route there to German idealism. So is it a category of reality or is it a category of the mind? Well, it's all universals or categories of the mind, which means that we can't know anything about God's being. And so we're back again to will. Again, we keep reverting to this kind of Islamic notion that God is pure will. That's the nominalist God. And that's why Aquinas accused, obviously Occam came after Aquinas, but he accused people who said that of blasphemy. Because you're saying there's no order in the mind of God and that you can't apprehend that order. So because the universals never go beyond your own mind.
I want to understand this. If universals and truths are only categories of the mind, and you can't know if your mind is a sufficient receptacle for external reality, you can't prove it, isn't that a kind of fundamentalistic faith? You have faith in something that you can't prove, namely that your mind is up to the task of understanding reality.
Right. So let's forget it. Well, I'm sick of all this scholastic disputation. Let's just talk about devotion. Let's just be devotional about this thing because it'll make you feel good. Well, that's a very dangerous path to tread. And that synthesis split apart into devotional religion and science. And that's the world we live in today. Okay, so we are now in a battle between religion and science. I went to Mass for the first time today in about 6 weeks, I guess, and I didn't have one, but everyone is wearing a face mask, and we're all sitting in every other pew because the state told us. The state told the bishops to do this. There was no consultation whatsoever. You are going to do what we say as the state because we are based on science, and science is contact with ultimate reality. We have contact with ultimate reality. You religious people do not, so therefore you do what we say. That's the relevance to right now, what's happening right now.
And is that all flowing from the Enlightenment presupposition that reason and science have beaten religion in the arm wrestle over who has control of ultimate reality?
Right.
And
there was a... Go ahead.
Well, tracking through the big picture of Logos Rising, it seems like Logos works in history in very unexpected ways. When you think it's dead and dust is on it, it rises up again in a way that no one could have predicted beforehand. And the guy that comes to mind now as you're talking is Hegel. And Hegel's understanding, the chapter on Hegel is very rich, and I had to consult the dictionary a lot. So, but I do recommend that people put on their philosophy nerd and pay attention to the Hegel chapter, because here's this guy, son of the Enlightenment in many ways, not a Catholic, but kind of drawn to Catholicism, comes up with this observation of history in which a synthesis is met by an antithesis, and from that comes a thesis, antithesis, and then thesis first, right? Synthesis.
Yeah.
Well, that's a kind of secular version of divine providence in history in a inchoate way, isn't it? Am I misreading it?
Absolutely. It's the Trinity.
The Trinity.
Here's Hegel trying to come up with the Enlightenment vocabulary that's going to describe the Trinity. Well, that's true. That's a good project. I applaud you for doing that, because we're talking about something serious now, especially compared to what's going on in England, which is Hume has run the whole thing into the ground, into pure skepticism. And Kant resurrected Logos in Germany, and Hegel is the culmination of that period of history. And now he's dealing with the Trinity. This is great. This is great. If you can do it and don't screw it up. But if you're going to do that, then you should listen to what the Catholics say, because they're saying, if you're going to talk about the Trinity, we're talking about contemplation. And it really is serious business, and you really have to have the mind prepared by religious exercises. And let's cut to the chase here. The best way to prepare is not screwing your chambermaid, which is what Hegel was doing. He got swept up in the sexual revolution in Jena. It was Schelling was having this affair when he arrived. Schelling is a handsome guy. He is the superstar of his age. And Hegel's kind of a dork. And he ends up having an affair with his chambermaid. And he's writing this at the same time he's writing the phenomenology of the spirit. Well, it's not going to work. It's not going to have a happy ending. I guarantee you. Not going to have a happy ending. And it doesn't.
Was Hegel in some ways a crypto-Catholic? In the way through his lens, I mean?
He was infatuated with Catholic girls when he was a teenager, and also with Catholic culture. It was all just one big kind of erotic fascination. And there was something there, because I don't want to badmouth Eros. I wouldn't be here without Eros. Okay, none of us would be. But at a certain point, it didn't work out, and then he got involved with this affair where he's got an illegitimate child. And then, when you're in a situation like this, you tend to crave respectability, and I think that was Hegel's Achilles heel, where he wanted that endowed chair. He really wanted that. He really wanted that more than anything else in the world, and he was willing to adjust whatever he was doing to make sure he got that end. And that meant suppressing Catholicism.
That's a good segue when you say endowed chair to the movement of Thomism through Jacques Maritain to Notre Dame, and a kind of beachhead of Thomistic thought post Leo XIII. Is it Aeterni Patris, his encyclical, wanting a resurgence?
So the whole project went down the drain. The whole Thomistic project went down the drain once again, and then we had the rise of the third Thomism. Thanks to Leo XIII and a group of people, including a German by the name of Kleutgen, who basically had to stop this infatuation with German idealism. We're not getting anywhere here. It's too hazy. We're going to get back to basics, and that means back to Aristotle, Thomas, metaphysical certainty, and that's going to be the foundation. And beginning with the revolution of 1848, they start building on this, and the culmination is Aeterni Patris, the flower of the Thomist revival at this point, where Leo XIII says Thomism is the official philosophy of the Catholic Church, and every Catholic institution should implement this. And that's exactly what happens. Now, it didn't happen in Germany because of the Kulturkampf, because of Bismarck unifying Germany and turning it into a Prussian satrapy. The Catholics became second-class citizens. But it did take on in France. It took off in France with people like the Dominicans. Obviously, they're the spiritual children of Thomas Aquinas, and someone like Garrigou-Lagrange.
This Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, the one of the dissertation directors of Father Karol Wojtyła, same guy.
Yes,
taught in Rome.
So you've got this man at the beginning of the 20th century, and there's this huge outpouring of Thomistic thought in France. And there's a young man in Paris at the time. They're all following Bergson, which is he's the Heraclitus of the 20th century, process kind of philosophy.
Henri Bergson.
And Henri Bergson. And suddenly, Maritain especially, who is a student, and they come together and suddenly realize Bergson is not it. It's Thomism. And Maritain converts to Catholicism. And then we have the disruption of World War I. And at this point, all of these people start looking to the New World. And they talk about Europe is like Constantinople after 1453 when the Turks overrun it and we have to carry off the manuscripts to the West. And so they go to the United States. And not just anywhere, they go to Harvard. Etienne Gilson went to Harvard and gave lectures there, and they were receptive. Even more so, Maritain shows up at the University of Chicago, where you've got a Jewish Thomist and a Baptist Thomist.
Is that
Mortimer
Adler? Yeah.
The Jewish Thomist. And it's just pure, it's just, Adler is realized, look, we've got Dewey. This is ridiculous. It's superficial. He's a powerful figure here, but there's no depth to this Deweyism. And so we're going to introduce something that has real depth. So let's bring the Thomist in, and you have a civil war at the University of Chicago.
Who is the Baptist?
What's the Hutchins?
Hutchins, okay.
Hutchins, the president.
But Adler died a Catholic. He did convert in the end.
Yeah, he did convert. So in the end, but at that time he was a Jewish Thomist, which was kind of an anomaly. But everybody, they're on their way. There was a huge outburst of Thomistic. This is what I'm trying to say here is this is the vehicle of Logos in human history. So Logos crossed from France. The Thomistic revival comes to America. America at this point is the savior of the world because of what happened in Europe. And this is the most fertile ground you can imagine. And this is why Maritain and Gilson are so excited about coming to the New World. So Gilson ends up in Canada, and Maritain, after the battle at the University of Chicago, ends up at Notre Dame University. Doesn't really end up there as never really took a job there, but he was the spirit, the moving spirit there in the 1950s. And this is 1953. Notre Dame University now says Thomism. They take Aeterni Patris to heart, and they say Thomism is now the official philosophy of the Notre Dame Philosophy Department. If you want a serious Catholic education, you come to Notre Dame. And in doing that, they're trying to position themselves as the national Catholic university. But everyone was doing it. I mean, I went to a Jesuit university at the tail end of this movement. I got there in 66, my freshman year, 1966. By 68, the anti-Thomism reaction had swept through and destroyed that beautiful edifice. It happened at Notre Dame. Notre Dame did have a kind of leadership role in Catholic universities. We know that because of Hesburgh's Land O'Lakes statement. He could get these people in a room and twist their arm and get them to agree. And they also basically took the lead in destroying Thomism. The man who did this was an Irish priest by the name of Ernan McMullen. Ernan McMullen strangled Logos in its cradle in the New World.
The Land O'Lakes statement, that's basically the divorce papers between Catholic University, higher education, and the magisterium of the Catholic Church, right? So we're talking July 1967, Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin.
Right.
I just did a video.
We're not talking about the magisterium. We're talking about basically theft of property. It's the alienation of
Right.
church property. It's illegal. It's pretty much it followed. What followed was a legal maneuver where they put the Notre Dame under a lay board of trustees and thereby alienated it from the
Gotcha.
Catholic Church.
Yeah, I had the opportunity
Now,
to.
the
Yeah, go ahead.
intellectual equivalent was what I just described about basically kicking Thomism out of the philosophy department. We're going to have, first it starts off with pluralism. And then it all ends up that we're all going to be analytic philosophers, and that's just boring. It's just quibbling about insignificant points, and then it just descends into nothingness. And the vacuum, we all know that nature abhors a vacuum, and so the man who filled that vacuum was not in the philosophy department. He was in the English department. His name was Joe Buttigieg, and he happens to be the father of the guy, the homosexual who ran for president, the nomination of president of the United States.
The Foucault-Gramsci scholar who brought all of that chaos to Notre Dame.
This is the man who brought Foucault and Gramsci, and that filled the vacuum that the absence of Thomism had created.
I did some research on the Land O'Lakes statement. I read it, and I saw the list of signatories, including Father Theodore Hesburgh, the longtime Lion president of Notre Dame, who you spent some time at the end of Logos Rising talking about. Another signatory is John Cogley, who was there for some reason. No one seems to know what. Didn't really have ecclesial connections. He ended up becoming an Episcopalian and a dissenter from Humanae Vitae. Surprise, surprise. Another signatory was an up-and-coming priest named Father Theodore McCarrick. Did you know that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I did know that.
So more bad fruits, pun intended, of the Land O'Lakes statement.
Exactly. And we could go into that whole discussion about, as Maritain said, the fish rots first at the head.
Mm-hmm.
So when you destroy your certainty about ultimate reality, when you destroy the metaphysical foundation, you tend to want to gratify your passions, even when they're illicit. That's what happened with Luther. That's what happened to Theodore McCarrick. That's what happened to the church in a nutshell.
There's maybe we can finish with your anecdote about Rockefeller and Hesburgh going to Rome to help Paul VI, his friend, Cardinal Giovanni Montini, help draft Humanae Vitae to incorporate, the message that Catholic teaching is wrong all along. Pick it up from there.
Yes. Yeah, I actually, I'm the guy who discovered that because I went to the Rockefeller archives and they showed me great place to do research. And they gave me the Hesburgh folder from the Population Council archives. And that's where the letter there. Hesburgh arranged a meeting between John D. Rockefeller III and Paul VI. And Rockefeller volunteered to write Humanae Vitae for Paul VI. Mm-hmm. One of those stunning moments. Henry James could have written a novel about that. And for some reason, Montini didn't go along with Rockefeller's plan and wrote his own encyclical and outraged everyone. And that's where the revolution broke out at Catholic U. And that's where Hesburgh betrayed Montini, who was his friend, by siding with the dissenters. So this deranged everyone. And one of the people who was there when it happened, actually, I was alive when this happened, but too young to understand it, but was Ralph McInerney.
I was going to say,
Ralph McInerney is the man who fought to preserve Thomism at Notre Dame. Fought a valiant rear-end battle and lost. He basically said, okay, well, let's take it out of Thomism won't be the part of the philosophy department, but we'll have a Maritain Institute and we'll have a Maritain Center and the Medieval Institute. So we'll make it a historical study. Well, that's not the way, that was not the intention of Leo XIII. This is not historical obscurantism about the Middle Ages. This is supposed to be a vibrant, living philosophy. But Ralph felt that that's the way he could salvage it, and that's what he did. And I was there when this happened. So this begins my connection with Ralph McInerney, a man
who was also a novelist, right?
Yes, the great. He was a genius when it came to writing fiction. He was a genius. He wrote too much. He should have concentrated, but he just was a genius, and he made a lot of money, including the Father Dowling series, which made him even more money because it got turned into a TV show.
Mm-hmm. And possibly you and I would not be speaking right now if Ralph hadn't been there at a critical, providential time.
You're right. So we had dinner, we had lunch at the Chinese restaurant on a regular basis, and then, I haven't seen him for a while, and then Dave Solomon, I'm at the Morris Inn on Notre Dame campus, and Dave Solomon comes up to me and says, Ralph would like to see you. He's not doing well. He's in the nursing home, the Holy Cross Village across the way. So don't spend a lot of time there. He's weak. So I go there, and Ralph wants to talk. And he's talking about his life as a literary man. And eventually it's like 3 hours later, I say, well, Ralph, I got to go, because he really wanted to talk. And it was one of those great moments. And so, he says, how are you doing? And I said, I'm not doing well at all. I mean, this was right after the Jewish revolutionary spirit comes out. I am toxic. I am plutonium. I mean, if I was never popular, but it's just really bad. And we are not doing well financially. And so he said, well, how much money do you need? And I told him, and he wrote a check because he was a wealthy man and he could do that kind of stuff. And he saved Culture Wars. And I wouldn't be here right now if it weren't for Ralph McInerney's generosity. I'm trying to. Go ahead.
No. I was going to add something else, but you were on a roll. I was only going to say if that's Dr. McInerney being weak, what would have been like that afternoon strong? I loved Ralph McInerney. It was a pleasure to be with him. One of my fondest memories is when we went to the Synod in Rome, and we're walking around Rome in the evening. It's one of those benign fall evenings in Rome. I couldn't imagine being with a more congenial companion than Ralph McInerney walking around Rome. Mm-hmm. And so at this moment, he basically saves me, saves the magazine, saves what I'm doing. And this is me. Is it a category in my mind or what? But I felt that he put the mantle over my shoulders because he was the last guy in the last ditch at Notre Dame. The man who defended Thomism to the end at Notre Dame. And then he writes me a check, and that keeps me going. And now I wrote the book on Logos. One of the manifestations of Logos, and this is a nice tie-in, and we can wrap up here, I think, is the Logos at work in the heart of the Catholic sexual ethic, that love and life belong together, that sex has a purpose, and that purpose is fundamentally toward procreation, and if you subvert or sabotage that end, you're going to have chaos. One of the stories that you've told, last week I asked you about the black woman who was going to call her mama because she wanted to kill herself because nobody loved her. Share about Maureen, because Maureen is a stand-in for millions of young women who are also part of this social experiment they weren't told about. And I think it's a story of kind of dying and rising in one person's life. Do you remember the woman who contacted you because she'd seen you on YouTube?
Yeah. Like the email, she contacts me and she said, I read Libido Dominandi and I read Slaughter of Cities, and that's the story of my life. That's the story of Maureen's life. So what did she mean by that? Well, she grew up in an Irish neighborhood. And then the blacks who were the proxy warriors of the Ford Foundation showed up, and they ethnically cleansed the Irish. And that was the end of a culture where she, if she fell down, all of the neighbors would come out and to make sure she was okay and take her home to her mother and make sure that her knee got patched up or something like that. Mm-hmm. Or if she was doing something bad, they'd tell her parents. That neighborhood was destroyed, and that was Catholic culture, got destroyed with it. And she went to the deracinated suburbs where nobody knew anybody or cared. And then she went to college, and that's where Libido Dominandi kicked in. And so she ended up having all these affairs in college, because that's what you do in college. And she ended up having 4 abortions. And because she listened to Madonna And that was what Madonna was telling all these Catholic girls to do. When she was gyrating around half naked or completely naked, she would wear a crucifix around her neck just
Papa,
so that
don't
these
preach.
girls got the message.
Yeah.
And so at that point she becomes a lesbian because she's sick of the sexual exploitation. She becomes a lesbian, and that doesn't work out. And now I said, and what happened then? You came back to the faith. Well, no, she became a Muslim. So there's that sad story. But I mean, that's the story of the Catholics of my generation. They were all exposed to that. It's a miracle anybody's still alive, given the toxic nature of what we were all exposed to. But that's the story,
Can we expect a rise of Thomism today?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I feel that writing Logos Rising has brought the issue back in some sense or other. That's my hope, because people all over the world are now reading this book, and all over the world you've got people who now have the philosophical lingua franca that they need to make sense out of things and not be intimidated by the Faucis and Gates of the world who are trying to tyrannize us by calling themselves scientists. So that's my hope.
Here's how the book ends. Let's see here. But the course of Logos in human history cannot be thwarted by the designs of the wicked. The moment of its apparent death in any age is in reality the moment of its eventual rebirth. Logos is always rising, no matter how it seems at any particular moment in time. History is an ascending spiral of rationality. God tolerates evil and error to bring about a greater understanding of the good and the true. With each historical cycle, the distinction between Logos and its opposite becomes more apparent. Because the distinction between Logos and anti-Logos in our day has never been more obvious, its victory has never been more certain. That's from the last page of Logos Rising, A History of Ultimate Reality. Its author, Dr. E. Michael Jones, has been my guest in this 2-episode series. Dr. Jones, thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.